Hey, I want to take some time today to talk about something that's come up quite a bit lately. You know, one of the new phrases everyone's using to divide people and make them angry and make them fearful, and that is defund the police. Now, I know a lot of people out there think that, oh, there's a whole bunch of people trying to get rid of police entirely. And I just can't imagine that's true. Now, maybe I just have too much faith in people, but I can't imagine there's very many people out there that are actually intelligent thinking people that believe that a society as complex and large as ours could possibly survive without law enforcement. We need law enforcement. Law enforcement is a very difficult job, but it's also a very necessary job. Unfortunately, recently, we've been doing a pretty bad job of actually providing proper law enforcement in this country. So now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying nobody thinks we should absolutely just defund the police and do away with them. I know everyone from liberals to leftists to libertarians that actually think that. And I just don't agree with them. I just don't think there's very many of them. There's some people that think that, but there's also some people who think the earth is flat. I don't think they're worth getting that worked up about or being scared or angry, etc. Listening to those people is kind of like, deciding, well, I might as well run up all my credit cards and spend my life savings because that dirty grown man in a diaper standing on a bucket down on the corner downtown told me that the world's going to end next month. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to listen to certain people, especially not to let those people influence your behavior. But that's kind of what's going on right now. Throughout history, the government's always needed a boogeyman to keep people divided and keep people scared. Right now, one of those things, like I said, is defund the police. I don't think anyone reasonable actually wants to defund the police. What I think they want to do is I think they want to diversify the police. They want to change how we do policing in this country because we've been doing a really bad job of it for a little while now. I don't think that blame falls at the feet of police only. I think it's got to do with, like I said, people in power wanting to stay in power, people being manipulated through fear and anger. It's just the way this country seems to have worked in the past few decades. And it seems to be working for the people in power and the people with all the money, etc. So they're keeping going with it to the point where they have a standing army now where we used to have police. And to understand, I think, what people want to do when I say diversify the police, or at least what I want to do when I say diversify the police, we have to look at how policing has been seen in this country for many decades. We have to go back as far as, let's go back to the 40s and the 50s. If you go back to the 40s and 50s and you look at a typical police department, you're going to see something like this. A whole bunch of officer friendlies. And I'm not using this here representation as an actual number. This is just a representation overall. So don't get tied up in how many people there are in a department. It doesn't matter the size. This is just a representation. Well, this served us very well for quite a while. And then in the 60s and in the 70s, the government decided that they need to kind of divide people a little more because people may have been coming together and realizing, hey, the government's doing some things we don't agree with. So they chose their boogeyman, and that was the dirty hippie. So they started saying, well, them dirty hippies is going to come eat your babies if we don't get more police. So they recruited more police and more police. And then they said, well, these things are getting out of hand, all these riots and etc., all these protests, against Vietnam and everything else. They're getting so out of hand that we need a special militarized group of officers that can go in and break up these riots. And that's why we need SWAT teams and people with riot gear, etc. So that started becoming a normal part of the police department. And then in the 80s, when people stopped being afraid of hippies because hippies had grown up and become CEOs now, they had to find another boogeyman, and that was drug users and drug cartels and drug traffickers, etc. Just drugs, drugs, drugs. They had to make it look like everybody was on drugs and the world was coming to an end. And if we didn't do something about it, it was going to destroy your way of life. So they took that little idea that actually started in the 60s to demonize hippies, that demonizing of recreational drugs, and used that to demonize a whole new group of people, and they started the war on drugs in the 80s. And because of that, they said, well, we need even more police that are able to break up these riots and deal with these drug cartels, etc. So we just started having more and more police, and a larger percentage of them were basically militarized. And then eventually it got to a point where they had people so afraid of the drug traffic and the war on drugs that the militarized faction of the police departments started becoming the front line. They started being what we saw more of. And then all throughout the 90s, they continued to militarize the police departments because they thought that that was a good thing, because that basically gave them a private standing army in pretty much every large city in the country. And they loved this idea of having a private army that was answering only to appointed officials, so they kept going on with it and on with it. And a lot of the officers went along with it because, for one, it was usually a little bit better pay, plus you got better toys, and who wants to be officer friendly when you can be a stormtrooper? And that's how we basically ended up with a standing army of jackbooted thugs on American soil that we're somehow told we're supposed to respect. I don't know about you out there, but I don't respect standing armies that don't answer to the people. So I have a problem with this, because if you look at this, if you look at what we have now, this militarized police department, if you look through history, I think you can see where this tends to lead. So this is why we need to change how we do policing. And we have to, like I said, diversify the police department. Instead of having this big standing army, let's go back to a more reasonable police department. I mean, it won't look exactly like what we had in the 50s, because we do have to have some SWAT element. Times have changed. We need to have those guys there. But we don't need them to be the entire department. We don't even need them to be the majority of the department. Now, some people, though, are going to say, oh, but what if things go really bad? We won't have enough SWAT officers. This can't possibly handle the problems we have. Well, for one, society isn't that violent. And two, if it does get that bad, that's what National Guard is for. But for things that are kind of in the middle, more than a normal police department can handle, but not quite worth pulling out the National Guard, well, that's why you have reservists, a group of civilians that volunteer to be trained so that they can be called up in times of natural disaster, upheaval, violence, whatever. If they're needed, they'll be there. But if they're not needed, they're not drawing a paycheck or standing around looking for a reason to exist. And since when you look at this new police department, when you look at the old police department and how expensive that was to maintain, it's very expensive to staff a private army, both manpower-wise and materials-wise, you're saving a lot of money now. And with that money, you can do better things. Because one of the problems with modern policing is that they are overtaxed. They are required to do things they are not qualified to do. Cops these days are asked to be everything from marriage counselors to therapists to mental health workers, social workers, and be police on top of all that. And that just isn't practical. And since going back to a reasonable number of police who are actually just being police would save us so much money, we can do other things like hire medical professionals, mental health professionals, civil servants that can handle civil issues, and even hire a traffic patrol. We can do all those things with the extra money. And all of these people can easily be deputized. It's far easier to take someone with a 6-year college degree in social work and teach them to be a police officer light than it is to take a police officer with a high school diploma and teach them to be a social worker or a mental health professional. That's just not reasonable to even think that would work. And when you do this, when you have these other little subgroups of police down here, that allows the actual police to just be police. And therefore, they can actually be better at their jobs. They can be better trained. They can be better equipped. They can not have to deal with a lot of the stressful stuff like homeless people, etc., that really drives a lot of police over the edge sometimes. So it would make policing a lot better, not only for the community, but for the police themselves. Now, this is where a lot of people go say, yeah, but these other guys, these deputized people, if they're not carrying guns and they're not full police and they don't control the situation as soon as they get there, they're going to be walked all over by people. They're going to be raped and beaten, blah, 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 etc. And I'm like, that's just not true. A lot of countries, the police don't even carry guns and they don't have those problems. Because here's something people fail to take into account. When you have a high stress situation like a domestic dispute or a dispute between neighbors over a property line or just two people fighting and cops show up with guns and start taking control of the situation and pushing people around as it is seen by the people in the stressful situation, that tends to ignite things sometimes. If you didn't have that, you'd see a lot less of that happening. And if things did get really bad when a social worker cop showed up, they can call the police just like anyone else can. They can call in the other people. There's nothing to say that, hey, we had to send a social worker officer over to this house. Let's have 2 patrol officers sitting a block away in their car. That's easy to do. That way they don't escalate the situation and they don't have to deal with the drama that they're not really trained to handle. And dealing with that kind of drama that they're not trained to handle, that does affect their mental state and that affects how they do the parts of their job they're supposed to do. So keeping them out of that is good for them. And as far as the traffic officers go, people be like, well, yeah, but on the traffic beat, you run into a lot of drug dealers and people transporting drugs or people with records, and they might just shoot them. Well, they wouldn't do that if they weren't police. If you've got a felony record or you got 10 pounds of heroin in the trunk and you get pulled over by a cop, you're like, well, this is fucking it. He's going to run me. He's going to know who I am. He's going to check my trunk, etc. I got to fight my way out of this or I got to run. If you get pulled over by a meter maid that you know is just going to take down your license number, take down your driver's license, and then send you on your way with a little ticket to appear in court and not even do a background check or search your car or anything like that, you're just going to say, thank you very much for the ticket that I'm not going to pay, and then you're going to go about your business. This whole notion that bad guys want to shoot it out every time they get close to being caught is ridiculous. They want to succeed with their crime. And you know, the main crimes that traffic police are running into is drug trafficking and priors. Because, you know, they're out there trying to hand out tickets to fund that huge militarized police department. And while they're doing that, they can't neglect their other duties as a police officer. So they're running into situations that a traffic cop wouldn't run into. Because the traffic cop, like I said, is just giving a ticket and saying, have a nice day. Whereas the police officer has to come up to the car. You know, he's looking at you with the mirrored sunglasses. He's got his hand on his gun. And then you panic. Because you know, fuck, I got a felony record or I've got something in the trunk, etc. We can avoid that because I don't think it's that important to catch people transporting drugs. Because like I said, I don't even believe in the war on drugs. And I don't think it's really making a dent in anything. Whenever you do that stuff, you're just catching little minor offenders who are just mules, etc. You're not stopping anything. So it's not worth the risk to the police themselves. So as you can see, I think it basically comes down to we have two options when it comes to policing. We can either maintain these private militarized armies that we have now that are extremely expensive, or we can diversify those funds and have a police department where police are allowed to be police and police light are allowed to do the other things that police are really not qualified to do, and do it in a way that doesn't cause as much violence and doesn't cause as many issues and cuts down on lawsuits against false arrest, cuts down on lawsuits against violence, etc. I think this would solve a lot of problems. I mean, I think if you look at these two options side by side, I think it's very easy to see which one would not only function better, but which one would lend itself more to maintaining a free society.